Hello again, folks. Today I'm here to chat with you about ear stretching, and more importantly, one of the very big mistakes I see people make when they decide to start stretching their ears. And it is a mistake that a lot of folks don't realize until it is too late. And that mistake is going by gauge when they stretch, and more importantly, the gauge unit of measurement. Now, when people hear gauges or gauge, a lot of times they think the actual physical jewelry that they wear in their ears or the actual act of stretching your ears, but both of those would be incorrect terms. Gauge is simply a unit of measurement. It's a way that we measure our jewelry and the plugs that you're stretching with, but it's also used for many other things. And therein lies the problem. See, gauge as a unit of measurement was never actually designed with body piercing or stretching in mind. Gauge as a unit of measurement was designed for wire gauge, and it started in the 18 and 1900s with the American wire gauge system, the Brown wire gauge system, and the standard wire gauge system. And all these systems were simply designed for measuring wire gauge, electrical wire, construction wire, and jeweler's wire. So in the late 80s and 90s, when body piercing was really beginning to grow in popularity, they would make jewelry in-house in studio, and they would do so by going out and purchasing jeweler's wire, which was in a gauge unit of measurement, and using that to make rings and barbells out of. And so they continued using the gauge system. And as the industry grew, we just kept using the system because that's what we had been using from the beginning, and jeweler's wire was convenient and available to make jewelry out of, and it just kind of made sense to keep with that system. And in small sizes, like the jewelry that we use for traditional body piercings, that system absolutely does still work today. It's maybe not the best, but it's still functional. But when we start talking about stretching our ears and going up into larger sizes, that system really fails us. I'm going to throw up a chart here and kind of show you what I mean. See how with things like the jump from 2 to 0 gauge, that's a 2 millimeter stretch. And if we look at 0 to 00, depending on what manufacturer you're buying from, that's a really large stretch too. And then look at the smaller sizes. It doesn't exactly make sense. We're hopping around between 1.2 and 1.6 millimeters, and then we're suddenly going 1 millimeter at a time, and then we're going 2 millimeters at a time, and then when we start to go up into inch measurements, which are still sometimes used in gauge systems, then we start really hopping around. I mean, 3/4 to 7/8 is a massive stretch. Same with 5/8 to 3/4. Now we're skipping 3-4 millimeters at a time. And if you've watched my guide on how to stretch safely, you know that when we're talking about stretching our ears, we really want to go in 1 millimeter increments. We don't want to try and stretch more than that at once because that's how we can tear and damage our ears. See, with gauge measurements, it doesn't matter if it's skipping around and not using consistent sizing because it's being used for electrical wiring and making rings and necklaces and selling certain weights of gold in. None of that relies on a perfectly measured millimeter system. So what if the wiring that someone needs between one size and another is a weird increment different? It doesn't make a huge difference. But when we're talking about stretching our ears and working with the natural elasticity of the human body, we really need consistent size jumps and consistent measurements. And so often I see folks get locked into the gauge unit of measurement and don't even bother to learn that there are these differences. And 2 to 0 is really the common place where I see this because many people don't know that a 1 gauge or a 7 millimeter plug exists. They just are locked in on that gauge system. They get their stuff and they're like, wow, the difference between 2 and 0 is really big. This is gonna really hurt. All right, well, and they just shove it through their ears. And this is how a lot of folks damage their ears and have problems. So my suggestion is to throw the gauge measurement system out the window and start going by millimeters. That way you're working with a consistent increment each time you stretch. And reputable companies are already doing this. Companies like Glassware Studios and Anatometal list all of their jewelry with gauge and millimeter measurements right next to each other. That way you know exactly what millimeter you're getting. However, a lot of cheaper and lower quality brands don't always do this. So a really great way to do this on your own is to purchase a caliper, which is a tool used for measuring. You can get digital ones that are really easy to use and they're not super expensive, and to measure all of the plugs that you get. This is great because it helps you make sure you're going in 1mm increments, but also, especially if you're buying from lower quality or less than reputable manufacturers, you can also make sure you're getting what you're being sold. See, since there's so many different wire gauge systems, American wire gauge, standard wire gauge, that also means that a lot of plug manufacturing companies go by variable sizes. And what I mean by this is that a zero gauge from one company may be 9mm, but from another company may be 10, and another company may be 9.5. And if you're just going by gauge and you're saying, okay, I'm ready to go from 1 gauge to 0 gauge, and you purchase a 0 gauge plug from a lower quality company, you're at a 1 gauge, a 7mm, and you're ready to go to an 8mm, you might get sold a 9 or 10mm plug because 0 gauge that company is using is through a different gauge wire system, and so it's much larger. Or conversely, you might be like, I'm ready to stretch and go ahead and buy a plug that's listed as gauge, and it comes a millimeter smaller, and you just bought the exact same size you were already at. So keeping a pair of calipers handy is really great because then you can measure and double check everything that you get and make sure that you're getting the correct size. And as an aside, I suggest doing this even with reputable companies as well, because sometimes tiny things can slip through quality control. Everyone is just human, but with a reputable company, they'll replace that for you super quickly, free of charge, and be super great about it. But always double check those measurements. So if you're thinking about stretching your ears, if you're already stretching your ears, I can't encourage you enough to swap from the gauge unit of measurement to millimeters and start thinking about your ears and your sizes in millimeter increments. And if you're interested in a more in-depth breakdown about the history of wire gauge systems and why we use what we use, I do have a whole blog post on my website that goes into this in depth, and I'll link that down below in the comments. Well, it was awesome hanging out, and if you are liking all of this content I've been doing about ear stretching, let me know in the comments if you want to see me do some more stuff about ear stretching. And as per usual, if you like everything I've been putting out, please hit like and subscribe, and hopefully we hang out and chat soon. Bye!